The Nebraska wind in the summer of 1944 was a relentless thing. It swept across the plains, carrying the scent of corn, dust, and a deep, simmering sorrow. For Sergeant Anna Schmidt of the Women's Army Corps, that wind felt like a constant whisper of everything she had lost. It whipped around the drab barracks of Camp Alice Springs, a newly established prisoner of war camp, and seemed to mock the very idea of peace. Annie was not a woman given to flights of fancy. She was practical, efficient, and emotionally guarded, with sharp blue eyes that saw the world in columns of figures and inventory lists. Her German surname, inherited from a father who had come to America seeking freedom a generation ago, had never been an issue. It was just a name, but that was before the war. That was before her younger brother Paul was killed by a German machine gunner on the bloody beaches of Normandy. Now her name felt like a brand, a constant reminder of the enemy, and a source of suspicion for the men she served alongside. Her job was to manage administration and supplies for the American personnel at the camp. It was a role she excelled at, bringing a quiet order to the chaos of a new military installation. Her commanding officer, Captain Miller, was a fair, by-the-book man who respected her competence, but others were not so gracious. Chief among them was Sergeant Frank Rizzo, a thick-necked, jaded supply sergeant from Chicago who had lost his cousin at Anzio. Rizzo saw the world in black and white, us versus them. And to him, Annie's name placed her squarely in a gray area he didn't trust. He missed no opportunity to make his disdain known, his comments dripping with a casual cruelty that stung more than any open insult. The tension at Camp Alice Springs ratcheted up the day the first transport of German POWs arrived. They rolled in on dusty trucks, a collection of young sunburnt soldiers, mostly from Rommel's vaunted Africa course. They stepped onto Nebraska soil with an unnerving swagger, their faces a mixture of defiance and arrogance. To the handful of locals who had gathered to watch, these were not just prisoners. They were the living embodiment of the enemy who was killing their sons and husbands overseas. A few days later, an order arrived from the War Department that sent a shockwave through the American staff. It was a directive based on the Articles of the Geneva Convention, outlining in clear, unambiguous language the required standards of care for prisoners of war. They were to be given proper housing, medical attention, and a daily diet comparable to that of the American soldiers guarding them. Furthermore, they were to be given access to recreational activities and the post-exchange, or PX, where they could purchase small comforts. The news was met with outrage. In the enlisted mess hall, the directive was the only topic of conversation. Sergeant Rizzo, holding court at his usual table, was practically apoplectic. "Can you believe this garbage?" he boomed, slamming the mimeographed directive down on the table. "We're supposed to treat these krauts like guests at a hotel. My cousin bled out in a ditch in Italy, and we're going to be serving his killers ice-cold Coca-Cola?" His eyes scanned the room and landed on Annie, who was eating her lunch in silence a few tables away. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Hey, Schmidt!" he called out, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This must be good news for you. We're going to be serving donuts and coffee to these fellas. Real American hospitality. Maybe you can sit and have a kaffeeklatsch with them. Trade stories about the old country." The men at his table snickered. Annie felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation creep up her neck. Every eye in the mess hall was on her. She wanted to scream, to throw her tray at him, to tell him about her brother Paul, about the telegram that had ripped her family apart. But she didn't. That wasn't her way. She met Rizzo's mocking gaze, held it for a long, silent moment, and then slowly, deliberately, went back to eating her lunch. Her composure was a shield, but beneath it, her heart was a knot of grief and fury. Her duty was clear. Captain Miller, despite his own reservations, had tasked her with organizing the logistics for the new directive. It was her job to amend the supply orders, to arrange for the German prisoners to receive their rations, and to stock the small canteen that would serve as their PX. Every requisition form she signed felt like a betrayal of her brother's memory. Coca-Cola, Lifebuoy soap, Lucky Strike cigarettes, donuts, the sweet, simple tastes of America, now destined for the men who had been her brother's sworn enemies. That night, alone in her Spartan room, Annie pulled out a worn photograph of Paul. He was grinning, his army cap pushed back on his head, his eyes full of the easy confidence of a boy who had never known real war. She traced the outline of his face with her finger, the paper softened by countless similar gestures. The conflict within her was a physical ache. She was a soldier, and a soldier follows orders. But she was also a sister, and her heart was at war with her duty. How could she offer comfort to the very people who had caused her so much pain? The day the German POWs were first allowed to use the canteen was a surreal experience. Annie stood by the door, her face an unreadable mask, a clipboard clutched in her hand. The prisoners filed in, their initial arrogance tinged with a wary curiosity. They stared at the shelves stocked with items they hadn't seen in years, if ever. They pointed at the bright red Coca-Cola signs, the colorful packages of cigarettes, the trays of fresh, glazed donuts. A young German corporal, barely out of his teens, bought a Coke. He opened it with a hesitant twist, the fizz escaping with a sharp hiss that made him jump. He took a tentative sip, his eyes widening in surprise. He took another longer drink, then turned to his friend with a grin of genuine, uncomplicated delight. Soon the room was filled with the sounds of men rediscovering small pleasures. The murmur of German, the clink of glass bottles, the rustle of candy wrappers. Annie watched them, her expression unchanging. These were the supermen of the Third Reich, the conquerors of Europe, and they were captivated by sugar and carbonated water. It was both pathetic and profoundly human. As she scanned the room, her eyes fell on one prisoner who stood apart from the others. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a quiet, weary face and deep-set eyes that held none of the arrogance of his comrades. He simply stood by the wall, observing the scene with a sad, detached air. After the prisoners were marched back to their compound, Annie was left in the sudden silence of the empty canteen. The air smelled of sugar and cigarette smoke. As she was locking up, Sergeant Rizzo appeared, leaning against the doorframe, a toothpick jutting from the corner of his mouth. "You looked pretty comfortable in there, Schmidt," he sneered. "Like you were hosting a family reunion. Don't you ever forget which side you're supposed to be on." Annie finished locking the door and turned to face him, her eyes as cold and hard as the Nebraska winter sky. "I know exactly whose side I'm on, Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It's the side that follows orders and does its job. You should try it sometime." She walked past him without another word, her back straight, leaving him standing in the long shadows of the setting sun. She had endured the first test, but she knew this was only the beginning. The sweet taste of America had arrived at Camp Alice Springs, and it had brought with it a bitterness she could feel in the very marrow of her bones. Life at Camp Alice Springs settled into a strange and tense routine. The German POWs, who had arrived with the defiant confidence of warriors, slowly began to change. The consistent, fair treatment they received was a form of psychological warfare they were completely unprepared for. The Nazi propaganda they had been fed for years portrayed America as a decadent, weak, and corrupt nation on the brink of collapse. But the reality they experienced was one of stunning abundance and an almost baffling sense of order and decency. 3 solid meals a day, clean barracks, access to books and sports. It was a world away from the brutal Eastern Front or the deprivations of the war-torn homeland many of them had left behind. The steady diet of American food and small luxuries was slowly eroding the foundation of their ideology. For Sergeant Annie Schmidt, the routine was a shield. She buried her grief and confusion in her work, finding a strange comfort in the clean, predictable lines of her ledgers. Her efficiency did not go unnoticed. Captain Miller came to rely on her implicitly, a fact that only deepened Sergeant Rizzo's resentment. He saw her professionalism not as a virtue, but as a sign of cold-heartedness, an unnatural lack of hatred for the enemy. He watched her every move, waiting for a mistake. The outside world soon intruded on the camp's delicate balance. A critical labor shortage was threatening the local sugar beet harvest. With so many of Nebraska's young men fighting overseas, the farms were desperate for able-bodied workers. After weeks of heated debate, the government made a controversial decision. They authorized the use of German POWs as agricultural labor. The news was met with fury in the nearby town of Alice Springs. These were small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew someone, a son, a husband, a brother who was in uniform. The idea of bringing the enemy to work in their fields, to walk the same land their boys were fighting to protect, felt like a profound betrayal. Captain Miller called Annie into his office. "Schmidt," he said, his face etched with worry, "this is a powder keg. I need someone to manage the logistics of these work details. Someone organized, level-headed, and tough. That's you. You'll be the liaison between the camp and the local farmers. It's not going to be easy." Annie felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. It was one thing to manage supplies from behind a desk. It was another to stand between grieving, angry civilians and the very men they held responsible for their pain. But she was a soldier. "Yes, sir," she said. Her first meeting with a group of local farmers was as difficult as she had imagined. They gathered in the town Grange Hall, their faces grim and hostile. A woman in the front row, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, stood up. Her name was Helen Gable, and she had a gold star pinned to her dress. "Sergeant," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "My son Billy was killed in Normandy 3 months ago. They sent me his things in a wooden box. And now you're asking me to let these murderers work his land? The land he was supposed to come home and farm?" The room fell silent. Annie looked at the gold star, a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice. She saw in Mrs. Gable's face the same raw, hollowed-out pain she saw in her own mother's eyes. The official military response died on her lips. She met the woman's gaze and spoke softly, her voice filled with a quiet empathy that cut through the hostility. "Ma'am," she said, "my brother was killed there too. His name was Paul. I know that nothing can make up for what you've lost." She paused, taking a breath. "But the harvest won't wait for the war to end. The Army needs that sugar. Our boys overseas need it. We have to bring it in." A subtle shift occurred in the room. In that moment, she was no longer just a uniform, a German name on a tag. She was one of them, a fellow traveler in the landscape of grief. The farmers, though still resentful, agreed to give the program a try. The work details began the following week. Under the watchful eyes of armed guards and a deeply skeptical Sergeant Rizzo, the German prisoners were trucked out to the beet fields. Annie oversaw the operation, driving from farm to farm, ensuring there were no incidents. She watched the prisoners work. Stripped of their military swagger, covered in the dirt of the American heartland, they looked less like supermen and more like what they were, farm boys, mechanics and clerks far from home. The older, quiet prisoner she had noticed in the canteen was part of the crew sent to the Gable farm. His name was Klaus. He worked with a silent, steady rhythm, his hands, though unaccustomed to the labor, moving with a natural competence. He seemed to understand the land. One afternoon, a crisis erupted. A crucial piece of harvesting equipment, a mechanical beet topper, sputtered to a halt with a loud clang of grinding metal. The machine was old and temperamental, and none of the American farmers, not even the grizzled old Mr. Gable, knew how to fix it. The breakdown threatened to put them days behind schedule. As the men stood around, scratching their heads and cursing their luck, Klaus stepped forward. He pointed to the silent machine, then to himself, and made a tinkering motion with his hands. He spoke a few words of broken English. "Engine. I fix." Rizzo, who was supervising that day, immediately stepped in. "Get back in line, Kraut!" he snarled. "You think we're stupid enough to let you touch our equipment? You'll probably sabotage it." Klaus flinched back, but Annie stepped forward, her eyes fixed on him. She saw not deceit, but a genuine desire to help. It was a risk, a huge one. But she also saw the sun sinking lower in the sky and the endless rows of beets waiting to be harvested. "Let him try, Sergeant," she said, her voice firm. "It wasn't a request. Are you crazy, Schmidt?" Rizzo sputtered. "This is a direct violation of—" "My direct order," Annie cut him off, her gaze like ice. "We need this machine running. He says he can fix it. He'll do it right here where we can all watch him." Reluctantly, Rizzo stood back. Under the wary eyes of a dozen Americans, Klaus opened his toolbox. He had been a mechanic in Stuttgart before the war. His movements were precise and confident. He diagnosed the problem, a sheared pin in the gearbox, and using a spare bolt and some wire, fashioned a temporary but effective repair. 20 minutes later, the engine coughed to life, chugging along as smoothly as ever. A collective sigh of relief mixed with grudging admiration went through the American farmers. Later that day, as the prisoners were lining up to board the truck back to camp, Klaus approached Annie. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his weary eyes. "Danke," he said quietly.
"Thank you."
"For trust," Annie simply nodded. As he turned to leave, he glanced down and saw the corner of a photograph sticking out of the small pocketbook she carried. It was her picture of Paul. Klaus stopped. He recognized the American uniform, the youthful face. A look of profound sadness and understanding washed over his features. He looked from the photo to Annie, his own eyes filled with a shared, unspoken grief. "I have a son," he said softly, his English slow and deliberate. "About his age. On the Russian front." The words hung in the dusty Nebraska air between them. An enemy soldier, a father, a man terrified for his child. In that instant, the uniform, the politics, the hatred, all of it melted away. Annie saw only a human being, trapped in the same senseless tragedy as she was. The wall she had built around her heart began to crumble, and for the first time since Paul's death, she felt a crack of light shine through. She went back to her office that evening and looked at her brother's smiling face. The simple certainties of good and evil, of love and hate, were no longer so clear. The world had become a complicated, messy, and painfully human place. And in the middle of a Nebraska beet field, she had just discovered a harvest she never expected. The successful harvest began to slowly change the heart of Alice Springs. Seeing the German prisoners not as monstrous caricatures, but as hard-working men covered in the same soil as they were, began to thaw the icy resentment of many townspeople. The POWs, in turn, were being profoundly changed by their experience. The daily exposure to American life, the well-stocked general stores, the friendly waves from children, the quiet dignity of families like the Gables was a more powerful form of denazification than any formal lecture. It was a silent, relentless assault of decency against an ideology built on hatred. But as the community softened, Sergeant Frank Rizzo's bitterness hardened. He saw the growing acceptance of the prisoners as a disgusting betrayal of every American soldier fighting and dying overseas. He became obsessed with the idea that the POWs were playing a long game, lulling the camp into a false sense of security before they showed their true colors. His suspicion focused intensely on Annie and Klaus, convinced that their quiet, respectful interactions were proof of a conspiracy. Then, the sabotage began. It started small. A cut fuel line on a supply truck, a batch of bread in the American kitchen deliberately spoiled with soap. Then, one night, the main tool shed near the motor pool was set on fire. No one was hurt, but the incident sent a jolt of fear and anger through the camp and the town. Old hatreds and suspicions flared back to life. Rizzo seized the opportunity. "See?" he declared in the mess hall, his voice ringing with vindication. "I told you. You treat snakes like pets, you're gonna get bit. This is what happens when you get soft on them. This is what happens when people forget whose side they're on." He shot a pointed, accusatory glare directly at Annie. The pressure on Captain Miller was immense. The work program was suspended. The POWs were confined to their barracks under full guard. The fragile trust that had been so carefully built over the past months evaporated overnight. An official investigation was launched, and the assumption from the highest levels was that it was an act of prisoner rebellion. Annie, however, refused to believe it. The sabotage was too clumsy, too theatrical. Cutting a fuel line was one thing, but poisoning your own side's food supply and burning down a shed full of tools you might need for an escape seemed counterintuitive. It felt less like a strategic military operation and more like a series of tantrums, designed to create maximum anger and blame, not achieve a specific goal. It felt personal. Her conviction that the prisoners were innocent was solidified during a quiet visit to the Gable farm. She had gone to officially inform them of the work program's suspension. Mrs. Gable met her at the door, her face a mask of worry. I heard about the trouble, she said, pouring Annie a cup of coffee. It's a terrible thing. But, Sergeant, I don't believe it was those boys. I've seen them. They work hard. They miss their families. That Klaus, he's a good man. Whoever is doing this, it doesn't feel like it's coming from them. It feels like it's coming from someone right here, someone filled with a terrible hate. Mrs. Gable's words echoed Annie's own thoughts and strengthened her resolve. She wasn't an official investigator, but she knew the camp's operations better than anyone. She started her own quiet inquiry, poring over her supply and maintenance logs at night looking for anything out of place. She noticed small discrepancies in the fuel and tool requisitions for the American Motor Pool, an area Sergeant Rizzo personally oversaw. She remembered seeing him lingering near the tool shed just hours before the fire, long after his shift had ended. A dreadful, unbelievable suspicion began to form in her mind. The idea was monstrous, that an American soldier, out of his own twisted grief and rage, would sabotage his own base just to frame the prisoners and punish her for what he saw as her betrayal. She needed proof. Knowing Rizzo's routines, she devised a trap. The camp was scheduled to receive a large shipment for the PX, including several crates of Coca-Cola. The night before the delivery, Annie stayed late in her office. Using a small brush and a bottle of ink visible only under an ultraviolet lamp, she carefully painted a tiny, invisible mark on the cap of every single bottle in 2 specific crates. The next day, she let a rumor slip to a notoriously gossipy corporal that Captain Miller was so sure of the prisoners' innocence that he was planning to release them from confinement and reward their good behavior with a special treat, a double ration of Coca-Cola. She knew the rumor would get back to Rizzo within the hour. That night, it happened. A loud crash was heard from the PX storeroom. When the guards arrived, they found the room ransacked. And in the middle of the floor, 2 crates of Coca-Cola had been smashed to pieces, the sticky brown liquid and shattered green glass covering the concrete. The next morning, Captain Miller assembled the entire American staff in the mess hall. The mood was grim. Rizzo stood near the front, a smug, satisfied look on his face. He demanded a full shakedown of the German barracks, insisting the culprits would be found with stolen goods. But before Miller could give the order, Annie stepped forward. "That won't be necessary, Captain," she said, her voice clear and steady. She carried a small, handheld lamp with a purple bulb. "I don't believe the prisoners were responsible for this, or any of the other sabotage," she continued, as a shocked murmur went through the room. "I believe it was done by someone who wanted us to blame them. Someone trying to stir up hatred," Rizzo laughed out loud. "And who would that be, Schmidt? Your German ghost friends?" Annie ignored him. "I marked the bottles in those 2 crates," she said, holding up the lamp, "with an ink that you can't see in normal light." She switched on the UV lamp and slowly began to scan the room. She passed it over the hands and boots of the soldiers in the front row. Nothing. Then she came to Rizzo. She held the light over his hands. Nothing. He smirked. But then she lowered the lamp to his combat boots. And there, glowing with an undeniable ghostly luminescence, were dozens of tiny splatters and specks of the invisible ink. He had been the one standing in the puddle of Coca-Cola, smashing the bottles with his feet. The room went completely silent. Rizzo's face went white as he stared down at his own damning guilt, magically revealed. Confronted with the irrefutable proof, his composure shattered. He broke down, not in remorse, but in a torrent of hateful, grieving rage. He confessed to everything, spewing his pain and bitterness, admitting he did it to stop the coddling, to get revenge for his cousin, and to punish Annie, the woman whose German name and compassionate strength had become the focus of all his misplaced anger. A few weeks later, Camp Alice Springs was a different place. Sergeant Rizzo was gone facing a court-martial. The POW work program was restored. The bond between the camp and the community now stronger than ever. One sunny afternoon, Annie stood on a small hill overlooking the vast Nebraska fields. Below, in a scene that would have been unimaginable just months before, American farmers and German prisoners of war worked side by side, bringing in the last of the harvest. Klaus, driving a tractor, saw her watching and raised a hand in a gesture of quiet, respectful greeting. Annie reached into her satchel and pulled out a cold bottle of Coca-Cola, the drink that had become a strange symbol of both conflict and connection. She popped the cap, and the fizz sounded like a long, slow sigh of relief. She took a deep drink. It was the sweet taste of America, not just of sugar, but of decency, of a complicated truth, and of a justice she had fought so hard to find. She pulled out the photo of her brother Paul. She looked at his smiling face, and for the first time the sharp sting of grief was softened by a sense of peace. She had honored his sacrifice, not with the blind hatred the world expected, but with a courage that was quieter, deeper, and far more profound.